Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome to this event. My great pleasure to introduce Professor Jessika Trancik here. Jessica is a professor in the Department Institute of Data Science and Systems at MIT. I think you should probably think of Jessica as an engineer who puts people, models people and their behavior in her models. It's sort of unusual, I guess, in the engineering field. And has done a lot of very interesting work relating to energy systems, energy transition, and so on. And that's principally what we'll be talking about here. Before we get to that, let me just make a couple of sort of down-to-earth announcements. Specifically for those of you who are online, I'm told that the event is being closed captioned, and you can turn on the captions by clicking on a live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, and then selecting Show Subtitles. So it's not of any relevance to people in the room here, but I'm told that there are about 300 people online. So we obviously have to cater to them. Those of you online also, you can ask questions, you can post questions at any time by clicking on the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and then typing in there. Those questions will appear over there and will be printed out and handed to me. So I'll eventually get them. Okay, so back to the main event. It's my pleasure to introduce Jessika Trancik, as I said. The format is that Jessika will talk for 10 to 15 minutes about her research agenda, the research that's being done by her group at MIT, and the sort of problems that they're wrestling with in the context of the energy transition. And after that, I'll sort of pose some questions based on that. And we'll sort of dig in a little bit more detail into some of the issues that she's raised. And then after that, we'll throw the event open to Q&A from people online and people here in the room. And then we finish in an hour from now. But Jessika, I'm dying to hear what you've got to say about the energy transition.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Heal, and thanks to those of you that are here and also online. So I want to say a few things about sort of the state of technology right now, the state of clean energy technology, and where we are with that in terms of being able to support a clean energy transition. And I'm going to address three main questions. So I'll give you the short versions of the answers right now in the beginning, and then kind of go through these in more detail. So one question is, how far have we come in developing the technological tools that we need to decarbonize energy systems and the economy as a whole? You may have heard that, we have all of the technologies we need to address climate change. And the short answer is that we have a lot of the technological tools we need to immediately drop emissions, probably by 80% or even more economy-wide at relatively low cost. So what are the remaining gaps? Well, one is that emissions are not falling as quickly as we would like, and sort of as we're not yet on a track to meeting global climate change mitigation goals of keeping global mean temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius and aiming for keeping the temperature increase below 1.5 degrees Celsius to sort of hopefully stave off the worst effects of climate change. So the second question is, what are the remaining gaps? And one of the remaining gaps is that these technologies that we have are not being adopted as quickly as we would like. And also to get to net zero emissions or that 100% decarbonization goal, there are still some technological improvements that we need. So what does that mean for engineers? Well, the way I like to think about technological development in this area and the engineering that we need in this area is not just to develop kind of fancy new tools and kind of look at the technologies that, we may need to reduce that last 20%. That's really important. We need to focus on those technologies. So that's things like future low carbon fuels for air transport and alternatives to support steel and cement manufacturing. So we need to focus on those engineering problems, but there are also a set of engineering problems that we need to focus on, which are really at the intersection of hardware and what I call soft technology, and that's the non-hardware technology that comes in many forms of codified knowledge. It can be software, but it can also be practices, construction practices, and planning and forecasting that is really needed to support a faster adoption rate of the clean energy technologies that we have today that are cost competitive, ready to go. Policy is also really important, and so we'll get into that a little bit. And really the connection between technology, policy, and engineering, I think, is one that we should really dig into in this conversation. The third question I want to address is, what have we learned about how to encourage and possibly accelerate processes of technological improvement and deployment? And the thing to keep in mind here is that we have had a couple of success stories in this area. We've had solar energy costs falling by 99% over the last few decades. Lithium-ion batteries costs have fallen by 97%. Wind energy costs have fallen substantially as well. And these cost declines have occurred over a couple of decades. For the next part of this technology improvement and sort of adoption phase to address climate change, we need to see faster trends than that. So it's important to look back and see what's worked, what hasn't worked. In some cases, we've seen that costs have increased. That's the case for nuclear fission reactor construction costs in the US. And so these are the kinds of questions that my group focuses on. And the whole idea is to think about how to be more deliberate about advancing technology to address societal challenges. And I focus a lot on climate change as one of these, one of the major challenges that we face as a society. So you may say to me, well, Jessica, I mean, we're deliberate about technology. Engineers are thinking about, how to develop technologies and are really good at advancing technology. I mean, we just saw vaccine development, in record time, right? If we think back to 2020, the spring of 2020, by, middle of that year, and, by the end of that, the vaccines were ready. By the end of that year, people were getting vaccinated, right? But where are we today? There's a huge, first of all, inequity in how vaccines are available around the world. There was a very slow rollout process. So that process, what I'm saying is that we need to think of that as technology as well. It's not just about the vaccines, but it's everything supporting that process. And you can see that depending on the policy tools that you use, that process is going to be more or less effective. But if we codify those processes, we understand what's working, what's not working, we codify it so that, that knowledge can be passed on. We can, accumulate that knowledge, share it around the globe, right? That codified form of knowledge, I'm calling that a technology for the purposes of my remarks. And I think we really need to be thinking about that for the clean energy transition as well. So let me tell you some examples. It's fine to say, okay, lithium-ion battery costs have fallen by 97%, and clean electric vehicles are available at relatively low cost. If you look at the cost of an electric vehicle in the US today, you can buy an electric vehicle for a below average cost in terms of cost of ownership. Below average in terms of new cars sold in the US today. So there are lower cost electric vehicles that are available. That's great. But, when we're talking about climate change, we need to think about how to make these technologies available for everyone. And what is the gap between those technologies being available and them being adopted by everyone. And one of the important gaps is, of course, financing. The upfront costs are higher. Another important gap is charging. Who has adopted electric vehicles in the US today? It's mostly people with, higher income levels, off-street parking. And, that is to really think about a technology transition where vehicles are electrified, which, by the way, can drop emissions substantially. you can reduce your emissions by 30% or more by adopting an electric vehicle today without changing anything else, even with today's energy supply mix. And by the way, my group put together a website called carboncounter.com, where you can look at different vehicle models and see what the emission savings are and the costs if you want to check that out. But to think about a transition, we need to think about these technologies really being adopted, the rate of adoption being accelerated. And it's important in the case of electric vehicles, just that example, then to think about, okay, how do we roll out charging infrastructure, where to place charging infrastructure, having a better understanding of people's behaviors in vehicles, looking at where, and at what powers these chargers should be placed. And the question is always about how to use limited resources. On the part of engineers, it's limited time. And on the part of policymakers and private investors, it's limited financial resources, put them to best use to allow for the adoption of these technologies, these hardware tools. And, also it's really important to make sure that those technologies are available and can be adopted by everyone. And so, that sort of equitable transition is really important and something that should be really not sort of an afterthought when we think about clean energy policy and technology innovation policy, but really at the front of these decisions. So, too much like these are two very different technologies. I talked about vaccines and now I'm talking about electric vehicles, but there's everything surrounding these technologies, the infrastructure that we really need to be thinking about more deliberately. And so that's something we're thinking about in my group, and using models that are informed by data to understand, people's behaviors, how to make technologies more readily accessible to people. So that's an area that I think is really important to focus on in terms of technological development, and really being more deliberate about that non-hardware technology in order to help accelerate this transition, this clean energy transition. But there are other areas where we still do need additional hardware development. So ultra low cost energy storage would be really helpful for decarbonizing electricity fully. So one path to decarbonizing electricity is to use a lot of solar and wind energy, which is relatively low cost at this point. But then, you have to balance out the fluctuations of solar and wind energy. And you can do that through a couple of different means: transmission infrastructure expansion, demand management, energy storage. And really driving down the cost of energy storage can really be an important tool that's important to work on right now. There are other energy services, so we talked a little bit about transportation. If you decarbonize electricity and then you electrify much of transportation, that's something that we can do with the tools that we have today. You can drive emissions down across many sectors, but there are other sectors within transportation, like shipping and aviation, long haul, heavy duty transportation, so large, trucking, that is a bit more difficult, potentially more difficult to electrify. So people are working on that and sort of converting these vehicles to electric vehicles and sort of short haul flights, for example. But people are also working on fuels. Hydrogen is one fuel that many are working on. There are other low carbon fuels that could be used. But that's an area, long distance transportation, not areas other than ground transport, where we need to be thinking about further development, further technological development. And then additionally, heavy industry. So thinking about, processes requiring high temperatures, steel manufacturing, cement manufacturing. There, it's important also to continue to work on hardware. And even for solar energy, wind energy, the more that you can really drive the costs down for these technologies, improve the performance, the more readily, the more attractive these will be in the marketplace. And that can also help speed up development or adoption of these technologies. So those are some of the, that's kind of where we are right now, and then some of the remaining gaps that should be addressed by technological innovation. But what have we learned about what works and what doesn't work in terms of really improving these technologies? We have a couple of examples now, as I said, where costs have come down substantially, technologies have improved. So one example that's often held up as a gold standard is that of solar energy. And, this has been talked about for, I don't know, the last few years. People have really, the trends have been going on for about 40 years, but in the last, 5-10 years, you started to see this technology reaching what's called cost parity, being cost competitive in locations. Now it's widely cost competitive in terms of an additional unit added to the energy supply grid. And, but the question still remained, why did this technology's costs fall? So if I asked you that right now, you can think about that. Some of you may say, well, there was a lot of investment in China. Others might say, well, it was all economies of scale. Others might say, well, it was, I don't know, a reduction in the cost of processing silicon for silicon modules, right? So there can be many possible explanations, but one of the things that we do in my group is to go back and look at, really try to disentangle based on the data, and then sort of developing models to understand at the level of the physics of this technology, how did it improve? And then what were the mechanisms that occurred in industry, and what were the kinds of government policies that led to this success story in solar energy? So costs fell by 99% over 4 decades. We looked at that, and what we learned was interesting. I'm not going to go into a lot of details here, but one key takeaway for policy is, let me actually start with the engineering level. What we learned is that, there were a number of what we call low-level mechanisms at the level of improving efficiencies of solar panels, the level of higher materials utilization, so you had to use less semiconductor material to perform this energy conversion process. There were a lot of these low-level mechanisms that helped bring the cost down. Once we start at that level, then we can say, okay, what was happening in government funded labs? What was happening in industry? And what you see from there is that there was this really interesting positive feedback loop that was set up by government policies that stimulated market expansion. So these are things like the Energiewende in Germany, a feed-in tariff for solar electricity, renewable portfolio standards here in the US, Japan's subsidies and, sort of 70s and 80s and out to today that stimulated markets. Then private companies came in and were working on this technology and helped drive the cost down. So one of the most, I think, interesting takeaways from that work, even though we started out at the engineering level, one of the most salient conclusions from that work was actually at the level of public policy, because what we saw is that we estimate that about 60% of the cost decline came about because of market expansion policies that were adopted around the world. So it was a little bit of a piecemeal collection of policies in the US, in Japan, in Germany, more recently in China. This created a market for solar energy, and about 60% of the cost decline can be attributed to those market expansion policies. About 30% can be attributed to policies directly supporting research and development. What does this tell us? Well, the other thing, by the way, that I should mention is that the kinds of improvements that you see in these technologies, in this technology, that came from those 2 different types of policies. So investment in research and development, market stimulating policies, the kinds of improvements were really different. So they couldn't really be substituted for one another completely. I mean, a little bit of substitution, yes. And I'm not claiming that this was the most cost efficient pathway for the development of solar energy. But it worked in this case to some extent, right? neither of those two policies alone, those kinds of policies alone, would likely have gotten us to the point where we are now. What's really interesting about this, kind of looking back, is a couple of things. I mean, one is that you may know that there's an ongoing debate, in Washington, I think, in other places as well. What should the emphasis be in terms of policy? Should we be investing in research and development, waiting until the technologies are good enough and sort of letting them take off on their own? Or should there be these market expansion policies? They could come in the form of a carbon tax, feed-in tariffs, et cetera. And the research, again, going back to the engineering level, what the research really shows is that both of these types of policies are really important. And now that we have these models, we can actually look forward for other technologies and say, okay, what should the right balance, or what is a good balance of investments in terms of these two policies to advance other technologies that we need, like hydrogen, various types of infrastructure, charging infrastructure, if we think of that as a technology. So all of this, I think, allows us to hopefully be a bit more deliberate in advancing technology that we need to bring about this major transition in infrastructure. And it's not just in individual pieces of hardware, it's in technology that forms infrastructure as a whole. And so that's really my hope, is that, and there are also some stories that are not so successful, like nuclear fission costs, where costs have increased. And I could talk a little bit more about why that has happened, perhaps. We can, again, look under the hood of these processes, get down to the engineering level, understand the processes of technological innovation and change, and then hopefully be more deliberate about targeting specific mechanisms in the future to achieve faster progress. Because it's really, markets are going to move toward a clean energy future. I believe that. The question is, will it happen fast enough to prevent the worst effects of climate change? And it's not happening fast enough now. It's also not happening in a way that is benefiting everyone. The benefits are very much focused on a small group of people. The damages, the sort of costs and sort of the damages are very focused on a small group, a separate, different group of people that are really suffering from the effects of climate change today and have contributed the least to the problem. And so it's a very bad situation in terms of both how rapidly technology is, moving toward this transition, and people and societies are moving toward this transition, and also in terms of who's benefiting and who's kind of losing out. And so I think that's where we really need to be more deliberate. And it's really at this intersection of engineering and policy where we can be more deliberate, but we do have some success stories to build on. So I am still optimistic, and I'll stop there with my remarks, and happy to take questions from Professor Heal and others.
Great. Well, thanks very much indeed. That was actually fascinating. Really was. I mean, I could ask you questions about these points for the next couple of hours, I'm afraid, but I won't. I've got a lot of pre-prepared questions here, but in some ways you've answered some of them and you've created new ones. I mean, let me pick up a point which I wasn't planning to ask about because I hadn't even thought about it, which is this concept you have of non-hardware technologies, which is very interesting. And that's sort of almost the interface between engineering and economics in this area. So it certainly speaks to me as an issue. And I can see your analogy between vaccines and clean energy is very interesting there, because in both cases, we've solved a technical problem, more or less, but we've been disappointed by the adoption of the rollout of vaccines, the adoption of clean tech. Can you say a bit more about how you conceptualize these non-hardware technologies and what their properties are? Have you got any more kind of really good case studies of that sort?
Yeah. So, yeah, no, I think it's something I'm really interested in and focusing on in the future. So the first step is usually to think about what service do these technologies provide, right? So in the case of solar energy, there's a soft technology component to it. You have the hardware, you have the solar panels, you have the inverters, you have the racking materials, you have all of the hardware, but the soft technology is the process that companies use to acquire customers. It's the process that utilities and in combination with companies that are installing solar panels use to support interconnection or connection to the grid. It's the processes that are used to install these solar panels and the planning, the software planning that goes into that. It's the management practices. So the service there is the service of, installing and operating this new energy system. And so that can actually be modeled depending on what performance metric you're interested in. So if you're interested in cost, that can be modeled as cost components of a system. It can be modeled in terms of, how it's changing over time. And I think the reason I'm saying let's include that in our focus on technology is that it kind of forces us to think about it in a way that's perhaps going to lead toward better outcomes. So be more deliberate about, and by the way, the empirical data suggests that we haven't done as good a job as we could potentially in the future. We haven't done as good a job in the past, because if you look at the costs that aren't, and this problem isn't all about cost, but I'm just using that as an example. If you look at the costs that aren't coming down, it is actually the soft costs of solar energy. It's the soft costs of nuclear fission, electric vehicle chargers and so forth. Yeah,
it's interesting. I actually read there was an IEA publication which I think commented that the cost of installing solar panels on roofs of private homes in California was 4 times what it is in Germany, which is extraordinary and shows there obviously is a great deal of scope for improvement there. For kind of spreading of some kind of technological advances there. Very interesting. I think I have to ask you a big picture question, which is that you started off sounding actually quite optimistic. You said we've come 80% of the way. That we have to go in order to solve the climate problem. And the remaining gaps are fairly small. But at the end, you sounded more pessimistic. And you said we're in a terrible place or something along those lines. What's your assessment of whether, probably not, this is not entirely an engineering assessment, but what's your overall assessment of whether the world has a reasonable chance of keeping temperatures to within 2 degrees of pre-industrial levels?
So probably if you ask me that like in the morning, I might give you one answer, and then by evening I'm like, oh man, and then waking up at night and So okay, what time is it? It's like about midday. That's good. We're about in the middle here. I would say that I can't answer that question actually. I am, I think, an optimist, or I like to think of myself, I try to be an optimist by nature, but I really focus on trying, just trying my best to do what little I can, but I do, and then also looking forward to, and I actually taught my last class 2 days ago, and I ended the class by saying, asking students, okay, once we've addressed this problem, okay, that may seem so far off, but what are you looking forward to about that? Kind of envisioning, if we do address this as a society, to bring some positivity to the discussion and some optimism, what will that world look like? So I guess to come back to your question, I do think that we can definitely address this problem, but I don't think that we can keep trying the same things that haven't worked, looking for the optimal carbon tax, assuming there's this big central planner, hoping for some big policy intervention. I'm not saying we shouldn't push for that, but, we have to try different avenues, try different there's new things happening in terms of social movements, the younger generations are really involved. So and that's, thinking about technology in a different way, engineering in a different way. And yeah, so, I'm optimistic, but if you ask me what's the likelihood, I would have a hard time answering that question.
I was very interested in your remarks, this is sort of vaguely related, about the decrease in the cost of solar. You said that roughly 60% of that was due to market expansion and 30% due to sort of government policies towards R&D, if I remember rightly. That was interesting because obviously what's happened with solar is a remarkably dramatic situation. So when you talk about market expansion, are you saying that's essentially a question of economies of scale? We've basically got a huge fixed cost industry and we're managing to spread that over, which is a much larger output, and the costs are going down simply for that reason, or is that something more complicated?
It's both. It's private R&D and it's also economies of scale. So R&D, research and development, and also learning by doing, which is this concept of repeating tasks and becoming more efficient at them. So it's a combination of those. If we look at recent years, economies of scale have really dominated the cost decline, but it's and the kind of research, but research and development in the private sector has been really important as well. But it's not, definitions are really important here. And what I'm including in research and development is, a lot of development, not only pure research. So it's the technologies improve following incremental, cumulative, assimilative processes, to quote Robert Fry, for those of you that are familiar with him. And, it's incremental improvements in producing solar panels, yields, right? So changing manufacturing processes so that you have a higher yield, you have to scrap less material, that sort of thing.
Do you expect something like this to happen with energy storage? Energy storage costs have come down a long way, obviously, as you said, but they are still in some sense relatively high. And if you look at the scale of storage we would need to handle intermittency in the US, then we'd be spending trillions of dollars at current costs. So, do you expect those costs to come down a lot, or is there something different between the technology for solar and the technology for energy storage, which means that we don't have the same potential for a cost reduction?
Yeah. I think that with the electrochemical technologies, electrochemical energy storage, batteries, different forms of batteries, including new kinds of batteries people are working on, I do think there's a lot of potential for cost decline following a somewhat similar process to what we saw in the case of solar energy. I do think that that's possible. It depends a little bit on the technology and what processes are involved, how materials based they are, because that's where we do see a lot of the improvements. And one thing I like to say about energy storage usually when it comes up is that the ways in which you can store energy, there's so many different ways in which you can store energy. If you just look at electrochemical batteries, there's so many different chemistries you can use. And, if we extend beyond batteries, if we look at like pumped hydro storage, and there may be a limited resource there, but, different forms of thermal storage, there's more diverse options than we have when we consider, the different energy conversion possibilities perhaps, or similar.
So then do you think that non-electrochemical storage mechanisms have potentially a big role to play?
I think where the natural resources are available, so where you have hydro resources that can be used for pumped hydro storage, where the social and ecological impacts are low of developing those resources, then I think it can be a fantastic storage technology. Now, there's also the question of the effects of climate change on that resource, and so that has to be considered. But it's really not available everywhere around the world, so it's not going to work everywhere. There are a lot of places where it won't.
So basically, we're we're primarily stuck with batteries?
I think,
Or,
well,
for example, let me
yeah.
another question. I mean, could hydrogen be another mechanism for storing energy effectively?
Yes, so hydrogen could, transmission infrastructure expansion
Yeah.
could,
Yeah, yeah.
is basically demand management. I'm super excited about demand management, which is moving energy demands in time and,
Sure.
and like cross locations. But yeah, I mean, hydrogen, the challenge there is really that it's not overall, it's not a very efficient conversion process, and the cost of electricity, if you're using electricity, is pretty high. If you're using natural gas through process of steam methane reforming, then the emissions are pretty high. So yeah, there's still some work to be done there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And here in the US, at least, there are three kind of major sources of greenhouse gas emissions. One is obviously power production. And you talked about that and the replacement of coal and gas by wind and solar. The other is transportation, and you've talked about that a bit. But the third one, which we haven't really talked about, is just heating and building heating, process heating, everything like that. I mean, what are the prospects there?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a possibility to electrify direct heating in households. You know, there are high efficiency heat pumps, and there's kind of proven technology to do that. That's cost effective in a lot of places. There are some challenges there in that we really need to understand all of the different surges in electricity demand that will occur or could occur as you electrify transportation. People come home, they plug in their vehicles, heating, you have a cold snap, the demand goes up for electricity. So that is a question that I think can be addressed, but that's one of the challenges with electrifying heating. If we're talking about industrial processes requiring high temperature steel, cement manufacturing, that is tricky, and there's open questions about what fuel could be used, or if one would rely maybe on fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. But then there are questions about, you know, air pollutant emissions and also, you know, costs and so forth. Yeah.
Right. Now, something we haven't spoken about, which is often touted as a potentially important in this context, is nuclear. There was a lot of discussion of nuclear renaissance at some point in the not too distant past. I mean, your group has done some very interesting work on the cost of nuclear. I mean, you mentioned earlier that nuclear is the only major energy source whose costs have actually risen rather than fallen over the last decade. Well, what's going on there, and can we change that?
Yeah, so what we see is that the culprit, again, and here we're talking about nuclear fission reactors and the cost of constructing plants, nuclear power plants in the US, the costs have come up over time rather than fallen, as we saw in the case of solar energy. So the costs are, you know, a little bit high right now relative to some other options. And the culprit is actually, again, the soft costs. So there were construction delays. Some of that came about because of safety regulations, but it doesn't all seem to be attributable directly to safety regulations. Essentially, what I think happened there is, or what is happening there is that, you know, each time you come to a new construction site, the situation's a bit different. And the ability of the industry to adapt to that hasn't been so great. And some of what's behind that is that they're still using outdated benchmarks. So their assumptions about, you know, productivity in terms of person hours to build a nuclear reactor are way off, but those benchmarks are still being used to make cost estimates. And so if you don't bring, you know, those back and closer to reality and really look at the variables that are driving the costs up, then you can't be, again, deliberate, I'm going to use that word, about reducing those costs. So I think, again, it's this, there's just a great need to bring those variables and that type of technology into the planning and sort of engineering design of these nuclear power plants. So I think there is a way forward potentially also for nuclear fission. But of course, one has to consider social acceptance and so forth. Yeah.
But I mean, so does that mean that, for example, sort of factory built small modular reactors might be a way of overcoming this problem?
Yeah, so there's, micro reactors, small modular reactors. There are different possibilities that people are working on, and it could be, it could be a way of doing that, but it's not as easy as just saying, okay, we're going to have these smaller reactors and then move them to the field, because you still have to go through a process of, meeting, understandably, safety regulations and permitting and so forth. So that still has to be brought into the design of that overall process of that technology. Yeah.
A question from way out left field. Is research on fusion a waste of time?
I don't think it's a waste. Yeah, I don't think it's a waste of time. I think it's good to keep that as a part of our portfolio, but we obviously can't be counting on that.
It's a very expensive part of our portfolio.
It is. So if you look at research and development funding in the US, so a large chunk of that has gone toward research and development of nuclear fission and fusion, and disproportionately small amount toward other clean energy sources. And so that, I don't think, I'm not sure what process went into, let's say I actually do know but the process that goes into balancing that portfolio is there are a lot of other considerations other than the data. Yeah.
Okay, I've taken a lot of time with questions, so I've got plenty more, but a question, yes, gentleman here. There's a mic just coming for you. You could use the mic because the people online will not hear you otherwise.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you. Very interesting conversation. My name is Fernando and I work as a consultant for development institutions. And I have two questions. First is whether you have done some research on social frictions and what people can be, or how people value the adoption of new technologies, and how policies can kind of nudge into that technology acceptance. And the second question is about what you referred about the pandemic. And my question is about, can we use digitalization as a mean to accelerate the achievement of the goals on clean energy? And have we learned anything from the pandemic, or have you registered any gains in the industry or in the infrastructure that will be hopefully permanent and will help us to get into a cleaner infrastructure? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the second question, was that about digitalization? Is that what you? Yes. Digitalization, yeah. So let me talk about that. Yeah, so I mean, I think that one of the areas that I'm interested in and sort of somewhat optimistic about, I guess, is in, demand management, as I mentioned. And I think with more, one thing we've learned in the pandemic is that, we can kind of adjust our behaviors to some extent in terms of working, for some jobs working at home, others not so much. And I think that obviously is supported by digitalization. And I think that we can potentially use that as a way to address certain demand events that we may see, surges in electricity demand as we electrify more energy services. That may seem like a kind of niche application, but it can actually be really important for supporting a decarbonized energy system, relying more on electrified energy services, so more electricity, and then also variable renewable energy where you have fluctuations in time. And so I think, potentially that could play a really important role there. And, to answer and in other areas as well, I think wherever we can use, digital representations or, rather than analog, or sort of represent technology infrastructures. I mean, data-informed models, right? That is, and sort of predictive models, understanding people's behaviors, understanding the potential cost of a construction project, all of that is really can be supported by the increasing amounts of data and computing resources that we have to really be more, to, really better design these infrastructures and target our investments in ways that are going to be more effective. So that's my answer to your first question. For the, your second question. For the first question, I think you were asking about social friction and maybe resistance to adopting new technologies. And I think that's a really important research area to understand what is driving people's decisions and also bringing them as users into, the innovation process. I mean, that's something that Eric von Hippel at MIT has, talked about for a long time, not applied to this problem. But I think that sort of like user-driven innovation is really important. Also, one thing that we've experimented with a little bit in my lab, although we haven't yet been able to test how effective it's been, we try to collect data on this, but we don't really know, but is with the tool that I mentioned, carboncounter.com. I hear from a lot of people that they're using it, to help inform their car purchasing decisions. And that is just a simple graph. It's showing the costs and the carbon emissions of different vehicle models. You can compare, your neighbor's car to your car, or your aunt's car to, your car, or whatever. And it's information that can, maybe inform people's decisions for people that want to reduce their own personal footprint. Because, at that stage, individuals are the investors in these technologies. So if you invest in technology that reduces emissions, in this case, 30% or more in most places, then you're really contributing to the transition. So I think those kinds of tools can help. In terms of policy to help reduce that friction, I think that, really more engagement with communities, more discussions around this energy transition. There will be, among, people that will be impacted in many different ways, having that conversation earlier, really being transparent about how the funds are being used, what the goals of these policies are. I think that's really important.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks. I've got about 20 questions from online here. So
okay, I'll try to keep my answers shorter then. Yeah.
Several of them, I won't read the details, but several of them feature turn on carbon capture and storage.
Okay.
And the potential for carbon capture and storage. So that's something we didn't really touch on at all. So maybe you'd like to make a few remarks about that.
Yeah. So carbon capture and storage, there are different forms. There are people working on direct air capture, where the idea is to capture the carbon emissions after they've been emitted. There are people working on capturing the carbon emissions, at the point of combustion. So before they're sort of emitted, and then of course storing that in some form. Ideally, you want to drive a mineralization reaction to convert it to a solid form so that it can be, stored for long periods of time. And not re-released because it's, so anyway, that's the technology. And I would say that it's again, an important technology to keep in the portfolio. It hasn't seen the uptake that some thought and maybe hoped. It's been around for a while, but it's important to keep it in there. For some of these processes, industrial processes, currently more difficult to decarbonize, energy services, air transport, shipping, high temperature industrial processes, this could be an important tool. So it's important to keep working on it.
Another question is, what's your take on ammonia as a feedstock for transportation sector? And you talked about hydrogen a bit, but ammonia is obviously related. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's an important fuel. I think it's a little bit what's really not, and and there can be many paths to producing ammonia. So I don't see it as versatile right now as hydrogen as a potential fuel, but I think it's an important one to keep working on.
Yeah, right. Right. Any more questions from the audience here? Yeah, lady back there. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Allegra. I am currently getting my master's in sustainability science at Columbia. Going back to the COVID vaccine analogy, I think one of the reasons why we were able to get a working vaccine in under a year is because the government said this is an existential threat for humanity. Let's fast track this, cut through the red tape. And I feel like we need some of that attitude for clean energy technologies. Yet in the last week, even with federal investigations into solar and the trade coming from China, it's really hampered solar development. I'm curious how you view the ideal regulation to foster clean energy development and what that looks like.
Yeah, well, I think a higher level of ambition, a real focus on this problem is important, and we should be doing more. And to your point, I think it's frustrating that this isn't viewed as a crisis, right? So that's the first thing. But then the other is, for each of these technologies we've discussed, you would likely want to place the emphasis in a somewhat different place. So if we're talking about, hydrogen, for example, right? There's money going in to from the infrastructure bill, a pretty substantial amount of money going into these hydrogen hubs. And so for that technology, what I'm hoping is that the focus is really going to be on the entire infrastructure needed to produce hydrogen. And it should be green hydrogen, or in the case where we're using natural gas, there should be carbon capture and storage. So that whole, not just pieces, but that whole thing. So that is going to be a combination, I think, of some research and development, demonstration projects, certainly, and then incentives for market expansion. Incentives for market expansion, but in a very particular, a format that's really suited to that problem. So each of these technologies, I think there's a somewhat different balance in terms of the regulations that we need, but certainly we need, and the policies that we need. So it's, market-based command and control and subsidies, or market-based regulation and subsidies. And I think we can find the right balance there. There's always uncertainty about the future, but each of these, areas of technology, I think there's a somewhat different balance.
Let me take one more question from online. Some of you talked about just a little bit, but not a lot. Do you think 100% sustainable aviation fuel will be available anytime soon? And if it were available, would you take a flight on it?
I would definitely take a flight on it. Yeah, certainly. I hope, that's a tough one. There's not much data to go by if we wanted to make a forecast as to when it would be available.
Right.
But I think it's going to be a combination. I think, again, we shouldn't forget the options of, we should be thinking about the pathway, and part of reducing emissions is also thinking about the routing. Again, this soft technology side, but also the aviation fuel. Yeah.
More questions? Yes, gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Josh. I'm taking my master's in sustainability management. So I have a few questions. First, for the generation side, what other source are you looking into that would go in an experience curve standpoint, whose price would go down as fast as solar? Because they're diversifying the portfolio from a transportation. So now going to my second question, transportation, how do you see it playing out if electric vehicle prices are going down, but ICE is also getting more efficient? Combustion engine for
internal combustion.
Internal combustion engine. Sorry. So and lastly, what movements do you see in carbon capture to kind of deviate away from government subsidies? Because from my own impression, is the general challenges of CCUS is they're heavily reliant on government subsidies, but for example, solar, there's a market that sustained it, and over time it brought LCOE down. And so I'm just generally curious I wonder how CCUS carbon capture will play out if they're so reliant in government subsidies now.
Yeah.
So those were like 3 questions.
All right, thanks. So how much time do we have? I'm going to try to be quick here. Okay.
No, we've got about 3 minutes left, actually.
Okay, good. Yeah, great. So if we think about solar, you referenced the experience curve. So this is just referring to the fact that roughly speaking, with each doubling of cumulative production of solar energy, we saw a 20% decline in cost, right? And that is what, when I referred to this 99% cost decline in solar energy over 4 decades, that was sort of following that curve. And then we said that lithium ion batteries, so we actually documented this with my postdoc, Micah Ziegler, at the end of last year. We documented the long-term trends in lithium ion battery costs and found that the cost declines were at similar, comparable rate to solar energy. So we had another technology that's followed this really rapid improvement, right? Both are quite materials-based, solar energy, lithium ion batteries, and much of that cost decline actually came about through improvements to the materials and the underlying chemistry, right? Also economies of scale and so forth. So what other technologies you're asking, I think about, you're interested in the primary energy resource, right? So we have solar energy, we have wind, costs have come down not as quickly. There's nuclear fission, potentially in the future, nuclear fusion. There's hydropower, limited expansion potential. There's geothermal, right? There's the fossil fuels. What's that?
Tidal power.
Yeah, tidal, exactly. So hydro, other, wave, tidal power as well. And I don't expect any of those technologies to follow a similar cost decline to solar or lithium ion batteries. However, we have the foundation now to build upon, where really the good news is that we really have now this super strong foundation of low-cost solar energy, low-cost wind energy, these inexpensive batteries. Those 3 technologies alone, the trends there give us this really great foundation if we choose to use it to rapidly decarbonize the economy. So we're not in the place that we were just 5-10 years ago. It's a totally different world in terms of the technological tools. They're not yet being adopted. So I don't think we need, in a sense, to see the cost declines that we saw in solar for others. It'd be nice if nuclear fission costs, we could bring those costs down a bit, so they're also cost competitive in places where they're so accepted by society. And then get a handle on bringing the cost of hydrogen down. Some of that's going to be around utilizing excess solar and wind energy in a decarbonized system, so predicting when that's available and using that. But sort of specifically to answer your question, there aren't any that I see on the horizon. In energy storage, it's different. I think we could see that with some of the other battery technologies that are being worked on. But I don't think that's a problem necessarily, because we sort of have this foundation, and then there's improvement potential in these other technologies. Certainly to provide we can provide low cost carbon-free energy. That question has been answered. Now it's a question of sort of how to actually get society and markets to move in that direction fast enough. Internal combustion engine vehicles, improving the efficiency of internal combustion engine vehicles, and efficiencies have steadily been increasing. And so that's important, to continue to do. Also, it'll benefit, also hybrid vehicles. But it's really important to focus on the transition to electric vehicles, personal vehicles. And at some stage, perhaps soon, it's going to be risky to not purchase. If you're going to buy a new car, it could be risky to not purchase an electric vehicle, in the sense that you see this phase out happening. We're still at small percentages, couple percent of vehicles in the US. And in Norway, more than 50% of new vehicles sold are electric vehicles. But yeah, I think the transition's happening. You have major companies announcing that they're no longer going to produce, fully internal combustion engine vehicles and sort of transitioning to electric vehicles. In terms of carbon capture, could the market for carbon capture take off on its own? And it's different. It's fundamentally different from some of the other technologies we've been talking about, because you're not producing an energy service. You're getting rid of the carbon. So it's an add-on to the process of producing a useful energy service. However, with the right policy incentives, with the right amount of social pressure, that can be done in places where, and for certain sectors where you're continuing to rely on fossil fuels. And there's also this concept that there's social pressure. There's also the risk of future policy. So if you're kind of not planning for transitioning away from fossil fuel infrastructure without carbon capture and storage. So you're not either retrofitting with carbon capture and storage or like really transitioning away from it, or any new builds adding carbon capture and storage onto that, then at some point in this transition that becomes very risky. Just the business case isn't there. And so I'm hoping that we're close to that point, but it's a tricky one. I think a combination of, regulations, command and control policies, and also market-based policies would be very effective in that case.
There was a big group of financial institutions announced just last week or the week before, right, that they would spend $1 billion buying carbon offsets generated by direct air capture in the next few years.
Yeah.
That's an attempt to get that market off the ground in the way that Jessika was just referring to.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, we're unfortunately out of time. It seems to have gone very quickly, but it's actually, I've checked several times, and it is actually over. So let me thank Jessika Trancik, who's the professor of the Institute for Data Systems and Society at MIT, for a fascinating discussion and a fascinating presentation. And we could happily listen to you for another hour, but we're not going to. And thank you for your attendance. I've been asked to announce that a video of this will be available on the website of the Center for Global Energy Policy within the next couple of days. Nothing more precise than the next couple of days, I'm afraid. Yeah, can you be more precise than that, Kime? Jessika? By Monday. Okay, by Monday we're promised. Yes, well, thank you very much indeed, Jessika. It's been great listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.